The story of Nat Turner and the rebellion he led remains one of the most haunting and tragic chapters in American history. It is a chapter that many would rather forget, and yet it is a chapter that deserves to be remembered in all its raw, violent, and heartbreaking reality. The year was 1831, and the backdrop was the searingly oppressive world of Virginia's antebellum South. Enslaved people toiled under a brutal system designed to strip them of their humanity, to break their spirits, and to erase their culture and identity. It was within this atmosphere, in the deep South, where Nat Turner, a preacher among the enslaved, was born into a world of unimaginable cruelty and despair. But Turner was different. He had visions, vivid, prophetic visions, which led him to believe he was chosen by God to lead his people to freedom. This is where the story begins, a rebellion of biblical proportions, a divine mission that would spill blood across the fertile soil of Southampton County. This is the story of a preacher who became a warrior, a man whose actions would haunt the collective American consciousness long after his death. The rebellion itself, which began on the night of August 21, 1831, sent shockwaves across the country. It was the largest and deadliest slave uprising in American history, leaving its mark on not just the physical landscape but also on the psyche of a nation struggling with its own identity and moral failings. But the rebellion itself is only part of the story. What happened afterward, the silence, the erasure, the historical amnesia that followed, is what makes this narrative particularly chilling. Nat Turner, for all the fear he inspired, was soon forgotten, his name buried beneath a mountain of propaganda and historical revisionism. Why was his story silenced? What were they so afraid of? And what does his legacy mean for us today, in a country still struggling with the very issues he fought against? These are the questions that linger in the shadows of the rebellion, haunting us even now. To truly understand why Nat Turner's rebellion remains largely forgotten, we must first understand the world he inhabited, a world shaped by systemic violence and dehumanization. The story begins with the system of slavery, which had existed for centuries, deeply ingrained in the fabric of the American South. Enslaved people were seen as property, less than human, subjected to unspeakable abuse, and denied even the most basic human rights. Their lives were ruled by fear, but also by the hope that one day, somehow, they might be free. For some, this hope came through religious faith. For Nat Turner, this faith would become a weapon, not just for personal salvation, but for the liberation of his people. Born in 1800, Turner was raised in the oppressive heat of Virginia's plantation economy. From a young age, he demonstrated an extraordinary aptitude for understanding the Bible, and it was through his religious convictions that he would eventually come to believe that God had chosen him for a special purpose. He was not the only one to hold such beliefs, but his interpretation was different. Turner came to believe that God had given him visions that were filled with divine revelation and wrath, guiding him to lead his people in an uprising that would rid the South of its chains. His visions were not the quiet whispers of a passive faith, but rather vivid, terrifying glimpses into a future where the oppressed would rise and break free from their tormentors. The first signs of rebellion were in Turner's mind, and over time, his visions grew more specific. He saw images of the sun turning black, of natural disasters, and of a war between the enslaved and their masters. These visions were not just symbolic to him, they were divine commandments. Turner's growing conviction became contagious. He began to speak to others in the enslaved community, preaching about deliverance, about salvation, and about the coming day when the enslaved people would take their freedom by force. Turner was careful to choose his followers, those who shared his deep religious fervor, those who were ready to fight, and those who believed in his divine purpose. But there were others who remained skeptical, some who feared the wrath that would follow, and some who did not share his vision. The seed of rebellion, however, was planted. By the summer of 1831, Turner's convictions were unshakable. He believed the time had come, and he began to assemble his small group of followers. They planned to strike when the moment was right, when they could catch their masters and the local white community off guard. Turner's rebellion, however, was not a chaotic, aimless outburst of violence, it was a calculated, deliberate act of war. Turner believed that he was leading a divine army, and that the bloodshed that would follow would cleanse the land and bring about the freedom of his people. The brutality of slavery had bred a deep sense of rage, and Turner's rebellion would be its violent eruption. On the night of August 21, 1831, the rebellion began. Turner and his followers, armed with nothing but their determination and a few makeshift weapons, set out to take the lives of the white slaveholders in their community. They moved swiftly through the night, entering the homes of the plantation owners, killing them and their families with terrifying efficiency. The violence was brutal, but it was not random, it was targeted, focused on the slaveholders who had enslaved and tortured their people. In a matter of hours, Turner and his followers killed dozens of white men, women, and children. The rebellion spread like wildfire, as more enslaved people joined the cause, driven by the promise of freedom and the will to fight back against centuries of cruelty. But the success of the rebellion would be short-lived. As news of the uprising spread, panic swept through the local white community. Militias were quickly formed, and the response to the rebellion was swift and savage. The state of Virginia, along with local authorities, launched a brutal counterattack. They hunted down Turner and his followers, slaughtering them without mercy. Turner himself was forced into hiding, but his capture was inevitable. He was betrayed by one of his own people, and after a month on the run, he was caught and brought to trial. It is at this point that the story takes a darker turn. What followed Turner's capture and execution was the beginning of an intense campaign to erase his legacy. The rebellion, which had been a bold act of defiance against an unjust system, was reframed as the work of a madman, a religious fanatic driven to violence by delusions of grandeur. Turner's name was smeared, and his rebellion was downplayed. It was a story of savagery and madness, not of resistance and liberation. The silence that followed was deafening. The rebellion that had so terrified the South was largely ignored in the years that followed, and when it was remembered as a dark, shameful moment in history that was best left forgotten. But the truth is that Nat Turner's rebellion was a turning point in American history. It was a moment that exposed the deep divisions within the nation, the moral rot at the heart of slavery, and the strength and resolve of the enslaved people who were determined to break free from their chains. Turner's rebellion is not just a footnote in history, it is a testament to the lengths to which people will go when pushed to the brink, when they are denied their humanity and forced to live in the shadows of oppression. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the desire for freedom will never be silenced. Nat Turner's early life was shaped by the brutal realities of slavery, a system that stripped away every shred of dignity from those born into it. He was born in 1800 in Southampton County, Virginia, into a world where the very notion of freedom was foreign, where human beings were regarded as property, and where entire families were torn apart. His family, like so many others, were bound to the land, forced to labor for their masters without hope of reprieve, and yet, in this suffocating environment, something extraordinary was taking root. Turner's mother, Nancy, was enslaved, and his father, also a slave, had fled to freedom when Nat was a young child. Nat's early years were defined by the absence of his father, and the presence of his mother, who was a quiet, constant figure in his life, and the harsh, unyielding world around him. He grew up on a plantation, and from the start, his existence was one of subjugation. Like all enslaved children, he had no rights, no future, no control over his own destiny. And yet, from an early age, Turner demonstrated a deep, introspective nature. He had an innate curiosity, and his mind sought solace in whatever he could grasp. This was a mind that was not easily broken, and this would be what set him apart from others around him. Although Nat Turner was subjected to the same labor and abuse as other enslaved people, his experience was distinct in that he found an escape in religion. Religion, for enslaved people, often became both a form of resistance and a means of coping with the crushing weight of their oppression. But for Turner, it would become something more. It would become the framework for his resistance. Turner was a devout believer, drawn not just to the rituals of Christianity but to the deep, unsettling themes of prophecy and divine justice. In a world that seemed to offer no redemption, religion became his portal to a higher purpose, and this belief would later take on a more radical and dangerous edge. Turner was known to be deeply spiritual, and by the time he was in his late teens, he was seen as a preacher among the enslaved people on the plantation. He would deliver impassioned sermons, drawing on biblical themes of deliverance, justice, and liberation. Turner's interpretations of the Bible were not typical of mainstream Christianity. His sermons were imbued with the urgency of divine retribution, the belief that a reckoning was coming for the enslavers. As a young man, Turner began to experience what he described as visions, vivid, otherworldly experiences that he interpreted as divine communication. These were not mere dreams or figments of his imagination. In his mind they were signs from God, a call to action, a mission given to him alone. The visions that began to come to Turner in his early 20s were the first signs of what would eventually lead to his rebellion. They were not peaceful visions of hope or salvation, but dark and violent glimpses of the future. Turner began to see himself as a chosen leader, selected by God to lead his people out of slavery. His visions were a terrifying fusion of religious conviction and apocalyptic imagery. He saw bloodshed, natural disasters, and battles that would rage in the name of freedom. These were not the quiet whispers of a man seeking personal salvation, but the desperate cries of a man who believed his mission was to deliver divine wrath to those who had oppressed his people for generations. At first, Turner did not act on these visions immediately. The weight of what he believed he had been called to do was immense. He grappled with the idea of leading a rebellion, an idea that was fraught with unimaginable risk. He lived in a world where rebellion meant death, where those who defied the established order were brutally punished. Turner was acutely aware of this. And yet, despite the dangers, he felt an overwhelming compulsion to carry out the mission he had been given. He began to share his visions with others in the enslaved community, but not everyone shared his conviction. Some were skeptical, afraid of the consequences of such radical action. Others feared the wrath of their white masters, knowing that the consequences for such defiance would be swift and violent. For a time, Turner's vision seemed to be an isolated, personal experience. He continued to preach and speak about the deliverance of his people, but the rebellion he envisioned remained a distant possibility. But over time, the pressure of these visions began to mount. He could not ignore the call, and he began to prepare in earnest for what he believed would be the most important action of his life. The vision of a divine reckoning was growing stronger, and the need to act, to strike before the moment was lost, became increasingly urgent. Turner began to seek out others who shared his fervor, individuals who would follow him into battle, who would stand by his side when the time came. Turner did not see himself as a mere preacher or a charismatic figure among the enslaved. He saw himself as a warrior, a leader destined to lead his people into a new world, one free from the shackles of slavery. The people who followed Turner were not mindless followers, they were fellow believers in the divine purpose he had articulated. His leadership was rooted in faith, in the conviction that their struggle was not just against their earthly masters, but against a system that was fundamentally immoral and unjust. The small group of men who joined Turner was a mix of those who believed in his message and those who, driven by desperation and a desire for vengeance, were willing to risk everything. They were not simply slaves looking for a way out, they were people fighting for their lives, their dignity, their humanity. The rebellion that Turner envisioned was not just about physical freedom, but about the spiritual and moral liberation of his people. In his eyes, this was the ultimate battle, a battle not just for survival, but for the very soul of his people. As Turner's group of followers grew, so did the sense of urgency. The time had come, he believed, for the vision to manifest in the world. The bloodshed, the violence, and the wrath of God that he had seen in his visions were not just metaphors, they were the necessary steps toward redemption. But as the rebellion drew nearer, Turner's followers began to question him. Was the violence truly the right course? Was it necessary to spill blood to achieve freedom? Turner's unshakable belief in his divine mission overruled any doubts. He believed that God had ordained this moment, and it was his duty to carry it out. This inner turmoil and the growing tension within Turner's group set the stage for the catastrophic chain of events that would unfold in August 1831. The rebellion that Turner had carefully cultivated in his mind, the rebellion that had been nurtured by his visions, was about to explode in a violence that would shake the foundation of the South. But as the fateful day approached, there was still much doubt. Would the group be able to rise up and carry out the mission? Could they overcome the fear and uncertainty that threatened to undo them? Would they live up to the monumental task Turner believed had been divinely assigned to them? The answer would come soon, but at this point, the tension was palpable, the uncertainty tangible. The darkness of the coming storm hung heavy over them, waiting to burst forth in a furious, uncontrollable eruption. For Nat Turner, the rebellion was not just an act of violence, it was the culmination of a divine mission. It was a moment in time when he could no longer ignore the visions that had haunted him, a moment where he would stand firm against the system that had oppressed his people for so long. It was, in his mind, an act of divine justice, one that would set the stage for his people's freedom, even if it meant blood would be spilled. The fervor that gripped Turner as he prepared for the coming storm was not just the fervor of a man driven by a vision, it was the fevered conviction of someone who believed they had been chosen to carry out a sacred duty. And when that duty was finally carried out, the consequences would be felt not just in Southampton County, but across the entire nation. The days leading up to the rebellion were filled with an eerie, growing tension, as Nat Turner's visions of divine wrath became increasingly vivid and impossible to ignore. He had been building towards this moment for years, through his sermons, through the private discussions with those few who shared his faith, and through the solitary communion with the God he believed had chosen him for a special purpose. In the quiet hours of the night, when the fields lay still and the heavy, oppressive air of the plantation settled over everything, Turner would spend his time praying, meditating, and preparing. He had come to see himself as a prophet, a messenger of God's wrath, and it was now clear that the time for action had arrived. Turner's vision was not a single moment of divine revelation, but a series of increasingly powerful experiences that seemed to confirm the inevitability of the rebellion. The signs came in waves, visions of the sky turning black, of blood-soaked fields, and of the earth itself trembling in the wake of divine judgment. He had seen these signs over and over again, and in each one, he believed, was a call to action. His purpose, as he saw it, was to bring about a reckoning, a violent cleansing of the land, the destruction of the slave system, and the liberation of his people. In his mind, it was no longer just a matter of personal survival or escaping the daily horrors of slavery, it was about fulfilling a divine mandate. But as Turner grew more resolute in his decision to act, the burden of what he was about to do began to weigh heavily on him. Though his faith was unwavering, the reality of the violence he was about to unleash began to sink in. Turner knew that the consequences of failure would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for everyone involved. His rebellion would not only endanger his life, but the lives of every person he called a friend, a brother, a fellow believer. He had no illusions about the brutality that would follow if the uprising failed. Yet, despite the fear that gnawed at him, Turner could not turn back. He had seen too much, heard too much, to ignore the call of his vision. The people who followed him were not all of the same mind, but they shared his deep conviction that something needed to be done. Some were driven by a shared belief in Turner's divine mission, others by the anger and desperation that came from years of brutal slavery. For these people, there was no other choice but rebellion. They had suffered for too long under the lash, under the watchful eyes of cruel masters who regarded them as little more than property. They were bound by the chains of slavery, but Turner had promised them freedom, even if it had to be taken through violence. But as Turner gathered his followers and began to share his plans, a certain tension began to build. There was unease, even among those who had followed him closely. Not everyone shared Turner's vision of violence as the path to freedom. Some were hesitant, unsure if the bloodshed that was about to be unleashed was truly justified. Others feared that their actions would bring about even more intense retaliation from the white slaveholders, putting their families, their loved ones, and themselves at even greater risk. It was clear that the line between faith and fear was a fragile one. For some, the call to arms was too much to bear. Despite these fears, Turner pressed forward. He knew that the rebellion would require absolute commitment, that any wavering would doom it before it had even begun. There could be no room for doubt, no space for second thoughts. In Turner's mind, the rebellion was not merely a fight for survival, it was a holy war, a final confrontation between the forces of divine justice and the forces of oppression. Turner had no illusions about what would happen if the rebellion was crushed. He knew that those who were caught would be subjected to unspeakable punishment, whipping, hanging, burning alive, but the risk of not acting was even greater. For Turner and his followers, there was no other way forward. To wait would be to die slowly, a death of despair and degradation. They would rather die fighting than live as slaves. As the day of reckoning approached, Turner and his followers prepared in secret. The rebellion would begin at night, when the shadows of the plantation houses would mask their movements, and when the unsuspecting white families would be vulnerable. Turner's plan was simple yet brutal: they would strike swiftly, killing the masters and their families before they could react. They would take weapons from the houses, arm themselves, and then continue their assault, spreading the violence throughout the region. The hope was that the rebellion would grow as other enslaved people joined in, a wave of resistance that would eventually overwhelm the system of slavery. But there was something else at play in Turner's mind, something darker, more desperate. The visions that had come to him were not just about freedom, but about revenge. Turner had seen the blood of the white slaveholders staining the land, and he believed that this blood was necessary to cleanse the sin of slavery from the earth. His rebellion was not just an act of liberation, but an act of divine retribution. Turner was not simply fighting for his own freedom or the freedom of his people, he was enacting the judgment of God. In his mind, the violence was justified by the righteousness of the cause. There could be no mercy in war, not when the stakes were this high. The time for compassion was over. The time for reckoning had come. On the night of August 21, 1831, everything would fall into place. The moment Turner had been waiting for had arrived. With a small group of trusted followers, Turner set the rebellion into motion. They began their assault on the plantation houses, killing their masters and their families with brutal efficiency. The plan was to move swiftly and silently, using the cover of darkness to catch their victims unaware. At first, the rebellion went according to plan. The initial wave of violence was swift, and the enslaved people who had joined Turner's cause began to feel the rush of liberation that came with the death of their oppressors. For a moment, it seemed as though the rebellion might succeed, that this would be the turning point in the long, painful history of slavery in America. But as the hours passed, the rebellion began to falter. Turner and his followers had underestimated the strength of the system they were fighting against. News of the rebellion spread quickly, and soon the local militias were mobilizing to put down the insurrection. The white community, gripped by fear, began to retaliate with terrifying violence. They gathered armed forces and began hunting down Turner and his followers, killing anyone they found, enslaved or free. The rebellion, once filled with hope and promise, quickly descended into chaos. Turner's followers, though brave, were no match for the well-armed militias and the overwhelming force of the state. One by one, they were captured or killed. The rebellion that had promised to be a catalyst for freedom was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own ambition. As the rebellion crumbled, Turner began to realize that his vision of divine justice might not unfold as he had imagined. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped him since the beginning began to take shape in reality. He could see the end coming, and it was not the triumphant victory he had envisioned. His faith was still strong, but the reality of failure began to gnaw at him. Would God still deliver him? Would his people be saved? The visions that had once seemed so clear now seemed distant, almost unreachable. For Turner, the rebellion was not just about the death of his masters, it was about the death of a system that had dehumanized his people for centuries. But the bloodshed that was supposed to bring freedom had only brought destruction. The tension between the spiritual purpose that had driven him and the brutal reality of the violence that ensued was beginning to unravel. In those final, chaotic moments, as the rebellion collapsed, Turner must have wondered whether he had been truly chosen or simply led astray by the overwhelming forces of fear, hatred, and despair that had shaped his life. The tragedy was not just in the death and destruction, it was in the uncertain fate of a vision that had consumed him, leaving him with nothing but questions and an unshakable sense of loss. As the days of the rebellion passed, the reality of Nat Turner's desperate struggle became evident. His once hopeful vision of divine justice had shifted into something darker, filled with chaos and uncertainty. What had begun as a carefully planned, faith-driven insurrection quickly deteriorated into something much more disjointed and fractured. Though Turner had ignited the spark of revolt, it was quickly met with overwhelming force, and the group of rebels found themselves scattered and vulnerable. The initial successes were fleeting, quickly drowned out by the swift retaliation from the local white militias. In the wake of the violence, something began to change not just within the ranks of the rebellion but in the hearts and minds of those involved. The early signs of tension were subtle but telling. As the group moved through the night, slaying their oppressors in their homes, there was a sense of urgency, a feeling that this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to secure freedom. Yet, as the attacks began to stretch into the hours of the morning, uncertainty began to set in. The surprise that had worked so well initially was beginning to wear off. The militia had already begun to gather and organize, with reports spreading like wildfire. Turner's forces, despite their fervor and belief in divine providence, were no match for the well-armed and well-organized whites who had long held power in the region. Turner's rebellion was not a simple act of violence, it was an expression of anger, a raw, bleeding cry for justice that echoed through the silent, oppressive landscape of the plantations. It was an emotional eruption that had been building for years, fed by the constant abuse, the relentless degradation, and the burning desire for liberation. Yet, as the first hours of violence unfolded, it became clear that the emotional charge that had fueled the rebellion was not enough to sustain it against the brute force of the system they were fighting. The slaves who had joined Turner in his mission were not soldiers, but men and women who had been raised in a system designed to crush their spirit. They were not accustomed to battle, and the moment the violence began to escalate, many found themselves faltering, unsure of what they were truly fighting for. Some of Turner's followers, gripped by the intense fear of retaliation, began to question whether they had been led astray. The brutal deaths of their masters had left them with a feeling of liberation, but now, with the rebellion losing momentum, that initial rush of freedom was starting to fade into dread. They had not considered the full consequences of their actions. For some, the reality of rebellion had begun to feel like a personal betrayal, not only to their former masters but to their own families and loved ones who remained vulnerable in the midst of the chaos. The harsh realities of war, the loss, the bloodshed, the sacrifices, were not so easily dismissed in the heat of the moment. As Turner's small group of rebels found themselves pursued relentlessly by the white militias, some began to lose faith in the cause. The fear of failure, of retribution, began to take hold. Those who had once been so resolute in their belief that they were part of a divine mission now found themselves questioning whether they had been misled. Were they truly doing God's work, or had they been swept up in the intoxicating fervor of rebellion, only to find themselves outmatched by the very system they had hoped to overthrow? The psychological weight of failure began to settle over them, and the consequences of their actions, both physical and emotional, became more apparent with every passing hour. There was also a sense of betrayal in the air. Turner's rebellion had begun as a united front, a collective effort to rise up and overthrow their oppressors. Yet, as the chaos of the rebellion intensified, the fractures in the ranks began to show. The number of followers had dwindled as many fled or were captured by the militias, and even those who remained began to question Turner's leadership. It was one thing to fight for freedom in theory, but it was another thing entirely to live through the carnage, to witness the destruction firsthand, and to realize that the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. The dream of liberation, once so clear and vibrant, had begun to feel like a distant fantasy, obscured by the fear and uncertainty of the present moment. The failure of the rebellion was not just a matter of numbers, of military strategy, it was also an internal collapse. The very belief system that had propelled Turner to action was beginning to show cracks. Turner's followers had believed in the righteousness of their cause, but as the violence escalated, it became harder for them to hold on to that conviction. For many, it was no longer about the divine justice they had fought for but about survival. They were no longer fighting to free themselves and others, they were fighting to stay alive in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the tide of the battle began to turn, the psychological strain became even more pronounced. The men and women who had once followed Turner with unwavering faith now found themselves questioning their decisions, torn between the belief that they were on a holy mission and the harsh reality of their doomed situation. In the midst of this internal turmoil, the physical hunt for the rebels intensified. The local militias, emboldened by the news of the uprising, were now moving with brutal determination. They were hunting down every member of Turner's group, showing no mercy. The relentless pursuit and the growing number of casualties took a heavy toll on the morale of those who had initially joined the rebellion. Turner's followers had started as believers, but now many were becoming victims of circumstance, caught between a violent, unforgiving system and a rebellion that had lost its sense of direction. The emotional and psychological strain of the pursuit began to break them. They were no longer fighting with the clarity of purpose they had once had, now they were simply trying to escape the vengeance of the white militias, trying to survive long enough to avoid capture. It was during this phase of collapse that the first whispers of betrayal began to circulate. As the pressure mounted, some of Turner's own followers began to question their leader, some even abandoning him entirely. The belief that they were part of something larger, something destined by God, began to erode as fear took hold. Turner had once seemed like a man chosen by divine will, a leader with a clear, unwavering purpose, but now he was just another fugitive, running for his life along with the rest. The rebellion that had once seemed unstoppable was rapidly unraveling, and as it did, the emotional and psychological toll on Turner's followers deepened. Those who had once fought for freedom, for justice, now found themselves gripped by the crushing weight of failure, caught in a cycle of doubt and fear. As the rebellion crumbled, Turner himself became more isolated. The followers who had once looked to him for guidance were now scattered, and many of them were dead or captured. Turner's final moments of leadership were marked by the desperation of a man who had led his people to fight for freedom, only to see it all fall apart. His own belief in the divine purpose of the rebellion was shaken as he saw his vision of liberation turn into a nightmare. The bloodshed that had seemed so righteous in his mind now felt like a curse. The rebellion had not been the salvation he had hoped for, it had been a tragic, violent failure, one that had left him with little more than the wreckage of a dream. The once clear line between divine justice and vengeance had blurred into a chaotic, tangled mess of emotion, fear, and uncertainty. Turner had believed that his rebellion would be the catalyst for the freedom of his people, but as the violence of the uprising spiraled out of control, it became clear that the rebellion had not just failed, it had left a scar across the land, one that would remain long after the blood had dried. The emotional collapse of Turner's followers, and Turner himself, was not just a physical defeat, it was the collapse of a dream, a vision of liberation that had been shattered by the brutal realities of war and the overwhelming force of the system they sought to overthrow. In the aftermath, the rebellion was not remembered as a heroic uprising but as a failed attempt to challenge a system too entrenched to be toppled by violence alone. Turner, once seen as a prophet, would be remembered as a martyr, but also as a tragic figure, a man whose belief in divine retribution had led him and his followers into a massacre. The legacy of the rebellion was not one of victory, but of broken dreams and lost hope. The emotional and psychological toll on Turner's followers would echo through history, as they were left with a sense of emptiness, a feeling of what could have been, if only the dream had not collapsed so violently. In the wake of the rebellion's collapse, the aftermath was swift and unrelenting. The very moment the final gunfire and screams had faded, the narrative of the revolt was swiftly rewritten, not as a fight for freedom or divine justice, but as a moment of madness, a moment that would soon be buried under the weight of fear, retaliation, and a campaign of historical erasure. Nat Turner, once seen as a visionary leader and a figure of hope for the enslaved, was now being cast as a demon, an embodiment of the savage, uncontrollable spirit that society feared. The white community, gripped by the terror of the uprising, sought to control the narrative of what had occurred, reshaping it into a tale of chaos and villainy that painted Turner and his rebellion as an aberration of nature rather than a symbol of resistance. The local militias, emboldened by their victory, began their brutal campaign of suppression. The violence they unleashed in the wake of Turner's uprising was not only directed at the rebels who had participated in the revolt, but at the entire enslaved population. The goal was not merely to punish Turner's followers, but to send a message to the entire community of enslaved people in the South, that any thought of rebellion, any idea of rising up against the system, would be met with swift, brutal retribution. Families were torn apart, individuals were executed in public displays of violence meant to instill fear, and entire communities were left shattered in the wake of the suppression. Turner himself, after weeks of hiding in the swamps and forests of Southampton County, was eventually betrayed by one of his own. The sense of betrayal must have been overwhelming, an intimate, personal fracture in the very cause he had devoted his life to. The man who had once been hailed as a leader, a prophet, was now nothing more than a prisoner, soon to be carted away to face the consequences of his actions. When Turner was finally captured, he was brought before a court that was quick to condemn him. His trial was a mockery of justice, a predetermined verdict dictated by the need to maintain the status quo and silence the rebellious spirit he had ignited. Turner's fate was sealed the moment he was captured. There would be no trial in which justice could be served, only a ritualistic scapegoating of a man who had dared to defy the very system that upheld the societal order. The trial itself was a deeply cynical affair. Turner, despite his profound convictions and unwavering belief in his mission, was not granted a fair hearing. His words, when he was allowed to speak, were twisted, distorted, and ignored by the very system he had sought to dismantle. The evidence against him was never truly questioned, and the trial quickly devolved into a performance meant to assure the public that Turner's rebellion was not just an isolated incident, but the result of a dangerous, uncontrollable madness. The story that the white community wanted to tell was that of an unhinged fanatic, a man driven to violence by religious delusion, who had led others into a senseless slaughter. The rebellion would not be remembered as a courageous act of defiance against a brutal system, it would be remembered as an act of chaos, one that had to be erased from the collective memory before it could inspire others to follow in Turner's footsteps. The media, in the months and years following the rebellion, played a crucial role in shaping how Turner would be remembered. Newspapers, pamphlets, and official reports were quick to label Turner as a fanatic, a man who had lost his mind in the throes of religious fever. The narrative of the rebellion was altered to fit a more convenient story, one in which the enslaved were depicted as victims, not rebels, and Turner was presented as a monstrous figure who had led them astray. The white South, terrified by the prospect of another uprising, worked tirelessly to paint Turner as a villain. His name, once a symbol of resistance, was now a byword for savagery and madness. In the years that followed, Turner's name would fade from public consciousness. The rebellion that had sent shockwaves through the South was slowly swept under the rug, buried beneath the collective fear and shame of the ruling class. The larger social and political questions raised by the uprising, questions about the nature of slavery, the rights of the enslaved, and the moral consequences of the institution, were largely ignored in favor of a return to the status quo. Those who had been affected by the rebellion, both the white families who had lost loved ones and the enslaved who had seen their lives shattered, were encouraged to move on. The white South was not interested in examining the deeper implications of what had happened, it simply wanted to return to a state of peace, where the system of slavery could continue unchallenged. But even as the public narrative shifted and Turner's memory was obscured, there were those who remembered. The enslaved people who had lived through the rebellion, those who had witnessed its violence and its promise, knew that what Turner had done was not an isolated act of madness, it was a desperate, courageous attempt to escape the hell of slavery, an act born of the unyielding desire for freedom. For them, Turner was not a villain, but a martyr, a symbol of the lengths to which one could go when faced with unimaginable cruelty. Turner's rebellion had been a flicker of light in the darkness of the South, a reminder that, even in the most oppressive conditions, the human spirit could not be crushed entirely. But Turner's legacy, even among the enslaved, would be complicated by the aftermath. In the years following the rebellion, fear swept through the South. Slave owners, paranoid and shaken by what had happened, began to tighten their control over the enslaved population. The events of the rebellion would lead to stricter laws, harsher punishments, and greater surveillance of the enslaved. The immediate impact of the rebellion was a tightening of the leash on the enslaved, as plantation owners and slaveholders sought to prevent any future uprisings by implementing more draconian measures. There would be no more room for hope, no more space for the dreams of freedom that had once burned so brightly in Turner's eyes. The system, already brutal and unforgiving, would become even more so, as the authorities sought to quash any potential for future resistance. In the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, Turner's followers, those who had survived, faced a harsh reckoning. Many were captured, tortured, and executed. Some were sold to other plantations, their families shattered and their lives irreparably altered. The surviving members of the rebellion were left with nothing but the grim knowledge that their cause had failed, that their dreams of freedom had been crushed by the overwhelming forces of power, fear, and repression. The emotional toll on those who had followed Turner was profound. The rebellion had been their hope, their chance to escape the horrors of slavery, but instead, it had led to their destruction. They were left to wonder if they had made the right choice, if the price they had paid was worth the fleeting hope of liberation. As Turner faced his own death, the final moments of his life became a symbol of the sacrifices made in the name of freedom. His execution was swift, brutal, and public, a final act of repression meant to serve as a warning to all who might dare to follow in his footsteps. Yet even as he faced his death, Turner maintained his resolve, his belief that his actions had been divinely ordained. His final words were not those of regret, but of defiance, an assertion of the righteousness of his cause even in the face of certain death. The authorities had won, but in his final moments, Turner's spirit remained unbroken. And so, in the years that followed, Nat Turner became an enigma, a figure whose legacy was erased, twisted, and distorted. He was remembered not for the bravery of his rebellion, nor for the divine purpose that drove him, but for the fear he had inspired, the destruction he had caused, and the violence that had marred his mission. His name was buried beneath a mountain of propaganda that would take years to unravel, and even now, his true legacy is one of both reverence and fear, a legacy that continues to provoke debate, reflection, and even outrage. Though Turner's rebellion was ultimately crushed, the question remains: what would have happened had the system of slavery been challenged by more men like him? What might have been, had Nat Turner's rebellion succeeded, and had it become the catalyst for a broader movement of resistance? Those questions linger in the air, unanswered, haunting the history of the South and the legacy of the enslaved people who fought for their freedom. In the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, the Southern states entered a period of heightened paranoia and repressive measures. Turner's revolt, though quickly crushed, left an indelible mark on the white community of the South. It served as a stark reminder that the system of slavery, despite its entrenched nature, was vulnerable to the fury of the enslaved. The specter of rebellion haunted the minds of the powerful, and they responded with even more aggressive tactics to ensure that such an uprising would never occur again. But beyond the physical retaliation and the tightening of the chains of oppression, there was a psychological and cultural shift that the rebellion instilled within the South, one that would ripple through history. In the immediate wake of the rebellion, the white community was gripped by an intense fear, a terror that the enslaved population might once again rise against their masters. News of the revolt spread quickly, and the very nature of Turner's actions, his audacity, his religious fervor, and his belief that he was carrying out a divine mission, shocked the South to its core. It was one thing for slaves to revolt in isolated, small-scale instances, but Turner had made an open declaration of war on the entire system. His act of defiance was seen as a declaration that the South's carefully constructed social order, where slaves were bound to the land and to their masters, was fragile and could be shattered. Slaveholders responded with swift and brutal retaliation, not only against the immediate participants of the rebellion but against the broader enslaved population. Militias were called in, and large numbers of African Americans were imprisoned, executed, or driven off their plantations. In some cases, entire communities were destroyed as the white community sought to stamp out any possibility of future resistance. It was not just a matter of punishing the rebels, it was about sending a message. The white South wanted to make it abundantly clear that any attempt at rebellion, any whisper of resistance, would be met with annihilation. But the suppression that followed Turner's rebellion was not limited to physical violence alone. It extended to the very core of Southern life. Laws governing the behavior of enslaved people were tightened to an extreme degree. Legislation was passed that made it more difficult for slaves to gather in groups, to learn to read and write, or to practice any form of religion that could be used to organize resistance. The fear of rebellion became so pervasive that the very presence of an enslaved person in a position of leadership, or with any degree of influence, became suspect. The South was no longer just trying to maintain control over its slave population, it was engaged in a systematic attempt to break the will of the enslaved and erase any possibility of collective action. Yet, for all the fear and repression that followed Turner's revolt, the memory of the rebellion would continue to haunt the South. The very presence of rebellion, the idea that the enslaved could rise up against their oppressors, would remain a constant source of anxiety for white slaveholders. Even as the system of slavery grew more brutal, the fear of revolt was a powerful motivator. It was a fear that led to a heightened awareness of the potential for rebellion, a fear that led to further brutality, and a fear that would ultimately shape the dynamics of slavery in the decades to come. The cultural legacy of Turner's rebellion also had an impact on the way that African Americans viewed their own struggle for freedom. For those who had lived through the rebellion, the emotional and psychological toll was profound. The harsh suppression that followed not only crushed any immediate hope for freedom but also left a lingering sense of loss. The failure of the rebellion was not just a loss of life, it was a loss of the dream of liberation, the hope that a collective struggle could bring about an end to slavery. Yet, for many of those who survived, the rebellion became something else, an enduring symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were those who fought back, who sought to bring about change. Turner's rebellion did not die with him. Even as his name was erased from the history books, the spirit of resistance that he had embodied lived on in the hearts of the enslaved. It would not be until decades later that his legacy would begin to resurface in the larger cultural consciousness. The bravery of those who followed him, the willingness to fight even in the face of overwhelming odds, would inspire future generations of African Americans in their own struggles for freedom and equality. Though the rebellion itself had been crushed, the idea of resistance, of standing up against oppression, would never be fully extinguished. In the decades that followed, Turner's rebellion would become a part of the larger narrative of slave resistance that ran throughout American history. Though the South had succeeded in suppressing Turner's immediate insurrection, the broader struggle for freedom would continue. Abolitionists, both black and white, would take up the banner that Turner had helped raise. The moral and political questions that his rebellion had raised about the nature of slavery, the rights of the enslaved, and the responsibility of a nation to rectify its own injustices, would continue to echo through the history of the United States. Yet, as much as Turner's rebellion would come to symbolize the resistance to slavery, it was also a reminder of the profound costs of that resistance. The violence of the rebellion and the brutality of the subsequent repression showed just how deeply the system of slavery had embedded itself into the fabric of Southern society. The rebellion was not simply an act of defiance, it was a confrontation with the very foundation of the South's economy, culture, and social order. It revealed the fragility of that order, but it also showed the depths of violence to which the system would go to preserve itself. As history moved forward, Turner's rebellion would not be forgotten. In the decades after the Civil War, the memory of Turner's actions would serve as a rallying cry for those who sought to end the institution of slavery. His name would be invoked by abolitionists, civil rights leaders, and others who sought to challenge the deeply ingrained systems of racial oppression that persisted long after slavery was abolished. But even as Turner's legacy was rediscovered, it was also often distorted or oversimplified. His story was used in different ways to support different causes, sometimes as a symbol of violent resistance, sometimes as an example of the costs of rebellion. What remained undeniable, however, was that Turner had been a figure who had forced the nation to confront the ugly truths of slavery, a man who had dared to challenge the system in a way that no one before him had dared to do. In the end, the legacy of Nat Turner's rebellion would be one of both tragedy and triumph. The immediate aftermath was filled with violence and repression, and the rebellion itself had failed to achieve its goal of emancipation. But the emotional and psychological impact of the rebellion was far-reaching. It planted the seed of resistance in the hearts of the enslaved, showing them that it was possible to fight back, to claim agency in a world that sought to strip them of their humanity. Turner's vision, though it ended in bloodshed, served as a stark reminder that the human spirit, even when subjected to the most extreme forms of oppression, could not be easily broken. For the white South, the rebellion was a reminder that the system of slavery was not as secure as they had believed, and it would forever be haunted by the possibility of future uprisings. For the enslaved, Turner's rebellion was a powerful reminder that they were not alone, that there were others who shared their pain, their anger, and their desire for freedom. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, resistance was possible, that the fight for freedom could be taken up, even at the cost of everything. And so, while the physical violence of Turner's rebellion may have ended in defeat, its legacy continued to shape the future of the South and the struggle for freedom. The emotional and psychological scars left by the uprising were not easily erased, and Turner's name would never truly be forgotten, even as the history of his rebellion was twisted and suppressed. His act of defiance would live on in the hearts of those who continued the fight, in the blood of those who came after him, and in the indomitable spirit of resistance that he had embodied. The ripple effect of Nat Turner's rebellion extended far beyond the immediate aftermath in Southampton County. While the South sought to erase his memory and diminish the significance of his revolt, the ideological undercurrent of his actions left an indelible mark on the collective psyche, both in the enslaved communities and the broader nation. Turner's rebellion illuminated the terrifying possibility of resistance within the very foundation of slavery, and though it was crushed, it gave rise to an unspoken, yet potent resistance that lingered long after his death. The power of his rebellion lay not just in the physical violence it had incited, but in the questions it raised about the very nature of oppression, freedom, and the human spirit's relentless drive to break its chains. While the South tried to restore order through repression and violence, the system of slavery itself had been irrevocably altered in the wake of Turner's rebellion. The fear that the rebellion had instilled among slaveholders became a permanent fixture in their governance of enslaved people. What had been a system of economic control, reliant on the quiet submission of laborers, had now become a system ruled by terror. Slave patrols were strengthened, and militias were regularly called into action to suppress any sign of unrest, real or imagined. This new, harsher reality, marked by more severe punishment and more intense surveillance, served not only to reinforce the ironclad grip of the slave system but also to reveal its inherent fragility. Slaveholders knew that they had barely contained a fire that could, under the right conditions, spread across the entire southern landscape. Turner's rebellion was not just an isolated incident, it was a manifestation of something much deeper, the fierce, pent-up anger of those who had been silenced, dehumanized, and reduced to chattel. And while his revolt was quelled, the spark he had ignited would not be easily extinguished. For many of the enslaved, the rebellion became a rallying point, a moment in history that proved the power of collective resistance. Even those who did not directly participate in the revolt began to question their own acceptance of the status quo, asking themselves whether submission to slavery was the only way forward, or whether their own moment of rebellion could someday come. In the years following the rebellion, Turner's story was largely erased from public consciousness. The South's historical narrative, carefully curated to maintain the legitimacy of slavery, had no room for a story that could inspire rebellion or suggest that slaves could be anything more than passive victims. His name was buried in the annals of forgotten history, and the rebellion was reframed as a violent, senseless act. Turner was depicted as a madman, consumed by religious delusion and spurred on by the fevered visions that had driven him to violence. His initial call for liberation was reduced to a tragic story of one man's misguided interpretation of divine will. The rebellion, which had shaken the Southern economy and social structure to its core, was rendered irrelevant in favor of a narrative that upheld the social order and rationalized the institution of slavery. However, despite the white South's attempt to suppress Turner's memory, the rebellion could not be so easily erased. Among the enslaved, Turner's name continued to be whispered, passed down through generations as a symbol of hope and defiance. While the public narrative sought to minimize his significance, in the hearts of many enslaved people, Turner became a hero, a martyr who had fought for freedom, regardless of the consequences. His rebellion proved that resistance was not only possible but that it could be justified, even when faced with insurmountable odds. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten, even as the South sought to bury it beneath layers of propaganda and violence. The ripple effect of Turner's rebellion was felt most strongly in the larger abolitionist movement. While some abolitionists condemned the violence of Turner's rebellion, many saw it as a necessary evil, a stark reminder that slavery could not be eradicated through peaceful means alone. Turner's rebellion forced many in the abolitionist community to confront the deep moral and political contradictions of a system that held millions in bondage. The rebellion demonstrated that the enslaved would not passively accept their fate forever, and it highlighted the lengths to which they would go to seek their freedom. Though Turner's rebellion was a violent and chaotic failure, it underscored a harsh reality for the abolitionist movement, that slavery's grip on the nation was so deep, so insidious, that it could not be dismantled through moral appeals alone. Turner's act of rebellion, though doomed, emphasized the urgency of the situation. Slavery was not just an institution of economic exploitation, it was a system of psychological and physical control that required more than just speeches or petitions to dismantle. Turner's revolt became a touchstone in the debate over slavery's future, forcing many to reconsider the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance and reconsider the real cost of freedom. While the white South worked feverishly to bury Turner's legacy, his rebellion also created an ideological fracture within the abolitionist community itself. For some, his radicalism was too extreme, too violent. They believed that peaceful means, like petitions, speeches, and moral persuasion, could achieve the goal of emancipation. But others, particularly the more radical abolitionists, saw in Turner's actions a reflection of the anger and desperation that had been building for generations. Turner had acted when he could no longer abide by the endless suffering of his people. His rebellion was not an isolated event but a reflection of a broader sentiment, one that had long been simmering under the surface. It was this radical vision of liberation, the belief that freedom was worth fighting for at any cost, that would fuel the more militant abolitionist movements in the coming decades. In the years leading up to the Civil War, the debate over Turner's rebellion became part of the larger conversation about how best to end slavery. While the South clung to its belief that slavery was necessary to its economic survival, the North increasingly began to see slavery as a moral abomination that could not be tolerated. Turner's rebellion would be invoked by both sides. The South used it to justify stricter laws and more brutal tactics of repression, while the North used it as evidence that slavery was not just morally wrong, but an institution that could spark catastrophic violence if left unchecked. The fear of rebellion that Turner had instilled in the South would only grow in the years that followed, culminating in the secession of the Southern states and the outbreak of the Civil War. Turner's rebellion would not only be remembered in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War but would continue to resonate through the Reconstruction era and beyond. The brutal repression that followed the rebellion only underscored the deep scars left by slavery, scars that would take generations to heal. The Civil War, though it would eventually lead to the abolition of slavery, did not erase the trauma caused by decades of brutality, nor did it undo the legacy of fear, suspicion, and anger that Turner's rebellion had unleashed. The legacy of that rebellion would continue to haunt the South, a stark reminder of the violence and oppression that had been perpetrated by the institution of slavery, and of the lengths to which those who were enslaved would go to achieve their freedom. As the nation moved into the post-war era, Turner's rebellion continued to shape the conversation about race and power in America. His name, once buried by the propaganda of the white South, would be resurrected as part of the broader struggle for racial equality. The memory of Turner's rebellion would serve as a touchstone for those fighting for civil rights, as a reminder that the struggle for freedom was never without its costs. Turner's willingness to fight for his people, to stand against the system that sought to crush his spirit, would be honored by future generations who sought to dismantle the legacies of racism and oppression. In the end, the rebellion that Turner had sparked may have failed in its immediate objective, but its impact on the cultural, political, and social landscape of the United States was undeniable. His defiance would inspire not only those in his time but generations of African Americans and abolitionists who fought to fulfill the promise of freedom. Turner's name, once buried in shame, would come to symbolize the power of resistance, the strength of the human spirit, and the unyielding desire for liberty that could never truly be extinguished. His story, like the rebellion itself, would live on in the hearts of those who refused to accept the chains of slavery, those who would continue to fight for freedom, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the echoes of Nat Turner's rebellion faded, the South worked relentlessly to create a new narrative, one that would allow the institution of slavery to persist without interruption. The rebellion had revealed cracks in the foundation of the slave system, and the fear it had stirred was not something that could be so easily ignored. Yet, the question of what Turner's uprising truly meant lingered, even as the authorities sought to bury it. For those who had been directly involved, for the survivors, and for the families of the executed rebels, the memory of the rebellion could not simply vanish into the air. In the years that followed, Turner's rebellion left an emotional scar, not just on the South, but on the entire nation. The sense of collective trauma among the white Southerners who had been forced to confront the reality of their own vulnerability was profound. The rebellion had shattered the illusion of absolute control that slaveholders believed they held over their human property. It exposed the terrifying potential of rebellion, reminding them that they could not expect submission and passivity forever. For the enslaved, the event had stirred an undeniable hope, a hope that ran counter to the years of degradation and brutality they had suffered. But hope was a double-edged sword, because with it came the cruel realization that liberation was not guaranteed, that the cost of resistance could be death. The aftermath of the rebellion, which saw the public executions of Turner and many of his followers, was meant to send a clear and forceful message: this act of defiance would not be tolerated. The public executions were not just about punishment, they were about spectacle. They were a grim reminder to both enslaved and free African Americans that the price of rebellion was unbearable. The state's swift action was designed to stamp out any lingering ideas of resistance among the enslaved population, showing them that any thoughts of rebellion would lead only to pain and death. It was also a deliberate attempt to discredit Turner's leadership, casting him as a religious fanatic, a madman who had led innocent people to their deaths under the false belief of divine command. But for those who had known Turner and the other rebels, the impact of their deaths was much more than a warning, it was a painful, haunting loss. Turner's vision had not been one of senseless violence, but of a desire for divine justice, a belief that the enslaved were not meant to live in perpetual bondage. To his followers, Turner had been a beacon, a symbol of their shared struggle for freedom. When he was executed, it was not only the rebellion that was snuffed out, but the fragile hope for a world beyond slavery. Though Turner's death marked the end of his rebellion, it did not extinguish the desire for freedom among the enslaved. His martyrdom only fueled a deeper, more clandestine resistance movement that would continue to grow in the coming decades. In the immediate aftermath, many enslaved people remained terrified of reprisal, wary of being accused of sympathizing with Turner or even inspired by his actions. The system of slavery had become even more oppressive, with heightened surveillance, crackdowns on literacy, and increased restrictions on mobility. Yet, amid this oppressive environment, Turner's rebellion served as a symbol of what was possible, a glimmer of resistance against an overwhelming force. His defiance, his willingness to fight back, lingered in the collective consciousness, even if it was never spoken aloud. As the years passed, the memory of Turner's rebellion faded from public discourse, especially among those in power who sought to rewrite history in their favor. In the South, any attempt to commemorate Turner or acknowledge the rebellion was seen as dangerous. Turner's story was deliberately minimized or distorted in the official narratives. He was often portrayed as a man driven mad by religious delusion, a savage who had led his followers into a senseless bloodbath. The rebellion was not framed as an act of resistance, but as a tragic aberration, something that had been brought about by the ignorance and superstition of one man. This official narrative was far more palatable for those who benefited from the system of slavery, for it absolved them of any moral responsibility and reinforced the notion that slavery was an institution that could only exist in a world that accepted certain fundamental hierarchies. However, for abolitionists, both black and white, Turner's rebellion remained a touchstone. His revolt was seen as an emblem of the deep unrest that slavery generated. For abolitionists who had worked tirelessly to end the institution of slavery through speeches, writings, and legislative efforts, Turner's rebellion served as a stark reminder that the brutal nature of slavery would never be eradicated through peaceful negotiation alone. Turner's willingness to rise up in armed defiance was a revelation for those advocating for the abolition of slavery, and his rebellion became, in many ways, an indictment of a system that denied basic human rights and dignity. For many abolitionists, Turner's rebellion became an example of the moral and physical price that would be paid if slavery were to persist. At the same time, there were many within the abolitionist movement who condemned the violence of the rebellion. They feared that it would provide ammunition to the pro-slavery forces, who could use it to portray abolitionists as radical extremists. To them, the bloodshed of Turner's rebellion was a tragic reminder of what could happen if the enslaved people were pushed too far. They believed in a more peaceful, moral struggle for emancipation, one that would convince both the enslaved and the general public that slavery was immoral and needed to be abolished. In their eyes, Turner's rebellion did little to advance their cause and, in fact, set back their efforts. Despite these disagreements within the abolitionist community, the rebellion and its aftermath were instrumental in fueling the growing abolitionist movement. The deep emotional toll of the rebellion and its aftermath also made their way into the literature and speeches of the time. Writers and activists used Turner's story as a means to evoke the humanity of the enslaved and to condemn the moral bankruptcy of a system that allowed people to live in perpetual bondage. Turner's story, though officially repressed, was refracted through the lens of abolitionism and used to call for the dismantling of slavery. In the decades following Turner's death, his rebellion continued to resonate as an emblem of resistance. When the Civil War broke out, it was not just a war to preserve the Union, but a war over the very nature of human freedom. The Confederacy's defense of slavery was a defense of a system built on brutality, while the Union's abolitionist cause sought to bring an end to that system and the dehumanizing oppression it created. Turner's rebellion had made it clear to many that the fight for freedom was not one that could be easily won or resolved through political compromise. It was a fight that would require not just moral persuasion but also the willingness to confront violence with violence, oppression with defiance. The rebellion that Turner had sparked, though ultimately unsuccessful in its goal of liberation, was an early manifestation of the broader resistance to slavery that would take on new life during the Civil War. Turner's actions helped lay the groundwork for the eventual emancipation of the enslaved, and his spirit of defiance was carried forward by those who joined the Union Army, as well as those who continued to fight for abolition through other means. The spirit of resistance he embodied would find new forms as the United States moved toward the eventual destruction of the institution of slavery. In the decades following the Civil War and the end of slavery, Turner's rebellion remained a symbol of both the cost of resistance and the possibility of liberation. His actions were often viewed through the lens of the larger struggle for freedom and justice in America. Turner's name, once buried under layers of shame and repression, was slowly resurrected, and his rebellion became part of the broader narrative of the African American fight for freedom and equality. His story would inspire countless others who sought to challenge the oppressive structures that sought to keep them in chains. Though Nat Turner's rebellion did not achieve its immediate goal of freedom, its legacy was far-reaching. It sparked debates, stirred the hearts of future generations, and contributed to the moral urgency of the abolitionist movement. It highlighted the deeply entrenched violence and injustice of slavery and exposed the lengths to which the enslaved would go to seek their own liberation. And even as the official histories of the South sought to suppress his memory, Turner's rebellion continued to inspire and provoke, a testament to the enduring power of resistance against oppression. His story, full of hope and tragedy, would live on in the hearts of those who continued to fight for freedom in the years to come.